Hi, welcome back aboard the Earthmote. I'm Randall. Today I want to talk about a sandbox style that I think works pretty well for running an exploration or hex crawl style campaign. It's a sandbox style that really evokes the idea of a wild frontier, sort of a harsh and hostile world that is right outside the borders of the civilized walls. But it's also a world where someone with a strong sword arm or the keen intellect of an arcane mind could rise to prominence and power regardless of their background and where they came from. The campaign style is known as points of light. The terminology points of light was coined during the 4th edition days of D&D, and it was used to refer to the default setting that came along with 4th edition. It was a world called Narath. And I know what you're thinking. Randall, 4th edition is probably as far as you could get from the games you like to play and the games you talk about. And that's true. I don't play a lot of games like 4th edition, but the basic structure of a Points of Light campaign is actually a lot older than 4th edition. If we look at some of the first original D&D campaigns, we see that many were designed with this very similar style of play and kind of creating these Points of Lights style worlds, even if they weren't called that back then. And the features of a Points of Light campaign, I think, really make a strong foundation for making an awesome sandbox environment that really encourages that exploration and making your character powerful through sort of heroic action on kind of a harsh frontier world. So today I want to go ahead and talk about what those principles are. There are 4 of them, and then how we can employ them in making our own Points of Light style setting. So let's go ahead and get into it. There are a few key ingredients that make a compelling Points of Light setting, and to really get that tone correct, we need to consider them and how we're going to implement them into our own campaign design. I've put the list on the screen now. There are 4 features I think that we'll want to consider. The idea of fallen kingdoms, small safe havens, dangerous wilds, and social mobility through heroic action. So let's go ahead and discuss each of these 4 topics a little bit further so we have a better understanding of what they are and how we're going to implement them. In a Points of Light setting, you need to incorporate the idea of fallen kingdoms into your world building. These are civilizations of great power that once inhabited your world only to be destroyed and lost to time. They have left fragments behind of their power. These are the treasures and powers that can be captured by the adventuring parties if they're willing to venture out and explore and delve the ruins for them. Now, Fallen Kingdoms are really an element that are incorporated into a lot of different D&D campaigns. They serve as great adventure locations in the story. So what makes the focus on Fallen Kingdoms in a Points of Light setting a little bit different? These Fallen Kingdoms are really going to be a large component of your source material for the dungeons and points of interest that the party is going to explore. They can shape the way the people and the civilizations that exist today happen to be in your world. And I think because there's a heavy focus on these ruined lands in a Points of Light setting, it can be nice to have a good sense of who these former kingdoms and people were. So that means you probably need to have a little bit more of an outline of these fallen kingdoms rather than just slapping a random ruin on your map and calling it a day. Despite what I'm talking about, you don't have to have super deep history and lore built out for all these kingdoms. A good outline with some cohesive themes for these past civilizations is really going to do some wonders for tying your campaign setting together as you're going out and building these different ruins that belong to the different kingdoms that have fallen in the past. If you want some help with making kind of these basic history outlines, check out my video up here on how to do it and my discussion on kind of those topics. The idea is that your world has regressed to a point where the great wizards, the enchanters, and smiths are a thing of legend. This is not going to be a high fantasy world. You can't go to a magic shop and buy a new magic sword. They're going to have to go out into the wilds and find it. If you want to make new magics or artifacts, those are going to be whole adventures in and of themselves. They have to go out and find the materials to make the artifacts. They have to learn and research in ancient libraries on how they could, enchant the items. And they might even have to find some old arcane forge to do the smithing at. So there's a lot of great sort of hooks and ideas here that you can really incorporate into the points of light setting and sort of encourage that style of play by, making these design choices early on in your world. For these fallen kingdoms, I think you want to have some sort of grand collapse. You want to be able to answer the question, how did these kingdoms fall into ruin? This is your chance to really make it something fantastical if you want. Maybe some demonic army scourged the land and wiped out most of the people. Or maybe you go with something a little bit more mundane and simpler. It could be an ecological disaster or a disease. It's really up to you and what you're feeling for your particular design on these different fallen kingdoms. One important outcome to keep in mind in a points of light setting is that there's going to be a lot fewer people now in the present day than there were in the past in sort of the golden age of these kingdoms. Looking at the 14th century in Europe, the bubonic plague claimed over a third of the European population in just 6 years. Your cataclysm that you're dealing with could be even worse than that. You could be 40%, 50%, 60% if you really want to lean into sort of dark fantasy style world. That's really up to you and what you're feeling for your own specific campaign design. I've actually talked about these fallen kingdoms and regressive world ideas in another video. I'll link it up here if you want further discussion on that. But I think this sort of first section really kind of hits the general points that we want to talk about when we're thinking about the points of light setting. I think the main takeaway here is that the people that remain now do what they can to survive, and they live in the shadows of the world's former glories. And that's really going to bring us to our next feature that we want to discuss. These safe havens are where the name Points of Light comes from. They are few and far between, but these havens sort of serve as beacons of light that keep the people safe from the greater dangers and threats outside of their walls. Now, you might be wondering, what do we consider small in this sense? And I think that's a good question. And in this case, I think we can reference a couple of data points to maybe get a general idea. We can look at the population numbers provided by the 4th edition Nereth setting. In the original Points of Light setting, there are some different descriptions of locations in the 4E source books, and then also the Dragon magazine that was published during the time. And we can also look at historically accurate population numbers for medieval towns and cities to get a sense of what those were like back in that time frame. From my experience, those population numbers in medieval Europe are actually smaller than what most people design for their fantasy cities and kingdoms by a fair bit. So this could help give us a bit more of that kind of smaller world mentality when we're kind of developing our Points of Light campaign. So looking at Nereth, we can see that the sizes of the villages, towns, and cities range from about 1,000 people to 35,000 people. Looking through the old Dragon magazines, I also found notes about farms and smaller communities surrounding the larger towns, hamlets, things like that, that multiply the population in the area by 5 to 10x. So a Point of Light area, if we use kind of those multipliers, could have a population between maybe 5,000 to 350,000 people. That's a pretty big range for our community size, but it would give a fine population to derive modest armies or mercenaries, hirelings, and specialists from for the players when they're kind of looking for those different characters they might interact with throughout the course of play. But it's not going to reach the mega city size that you see in Waterdeep in Faerun or Sharn of Eberron, for examples, in more populated kind of high fantasy settings. Now, what if we compare these Nereth population sizes with historical numbers? We see they are actually pretty accurate. From the table on the screen now, you can see estimated population sizes of different settlement types in medieval Europe. We know historically medieval Europe was overwhelmingly agrarian. The vast majority of the population was involved in agriculture and farming. Now, the population size is going to vary quite dramatically depending on where you are in medieval Europe, but I think this gives us a nice ballpark to kind of look at and give us a sense check for our Points of Light settings. Estimates put 75% to 90% of the population dedicated towards agriculture. This means that our large town or city population multiplier in medieval Europe is going to be 4 to 10x. And that actually lines up really well with the population multiplier we see in Nereth, which is 5 to 10x. So I think this gives us a good sense of where our community sizes should probably fall for these different states that you're going to place within your hex map or your campaign map for your Points of Light campaign. The other point about small safe havens is the idea of the distance between them and the next point of light, the next state that they might come across. These areas do have some notable distance between them. That's because these points of light are meant to feel somewhat isolated from one another. Now, I do think you can have roads between the small states because I do like the idea of some travel and trade happening, and it's not just some sort of stagnant and completely isolated world, but it should be somewhat difficult and risky to embark on those journeys. And I also think it's a good idea to have the possibility of military action happening between these city-states. But an army moving between states is going to have a different set of challenges than a small caravan or adventuring group might have on the road. The isolated nature of these states means that anyone hoping to travel between one state to another must undertake a risky journey to get there, because you're going to have to brave the dangerous wilds that surround these otherwise kind of frontier kingdoms in your world. Which of course brings us to our next feature. Outside of the safe havens, the world is a dangerous place. Bandits, monsters, hostile humanoids, and so on. All of these are threats to an adventurer embarking on a journey. The lack of civilization means that anyone setting out will need to be self-sufficient. They need to be able to protect and defend themselves. I think most of these ideas are pretty straightforward and similar to what you'd face in any campaign setup. Present difficult monsters, traps, and hazards in your world, and let the players figure out how to deal with them. I think the main difference here is the vastness of the wilds that surrounds the party. Everything feels like a frontier. I've been reading some Conan the Barbarian stories, and his time spent as a frontiersman and scout really kind of highlights those realities that the player should face in your campaign setting. The frontier is a hostile place, and it's a really harsh way to live, and many don't survive it. You can look at allegories to maybe the American West when settlers were moving out there. Many didn't survive. They suffered disease, harsh environments, dangerous monsters, and other threats as well. If the wilds are so dangerous, why would anyone want to leave their safe havens? Well, that's a good question, and the answer is that most people wouldn't. But the adventuring party is not most people. They are built differently. Beyond the fact that it's a game and your players want to go on adventure, adventurers in-game accept risk for fortune, fame, and power. In other words, adventurers go into wilds because the rewards are worth the risk to them. One of the big things you might think about in your games is, well, if there are all these ruins of fallen kingdoms around, why haven't the people gone out and looted them? Why wouldn't they want to get rich themselves? And it's a good question, and I think it's answered mostly by our previous discussions. The population sizes have collapsed since the fall of the golden days. Most people are just trying to survive to get by. And then, of course, the harshness of the frontier-esque lifestyle is hard enough without going into monster-infested forests, so most are going to stay behind their safe walls. But then on top of that, you need to defend the safe havens. They're safe because the community is willing to work together to coordinate defenses of their civilization. Sometimes that involves the employment of brash adventuring parties to go out and do dangerous deeds for them, ones that are willing to risk their lives in turn for money, fame, and power. This is where your party can see that ability to improve their station in life by taking up these hard-to-do tasks. If you look at medieval Europe, nobility was nobility. Unless you were born into it, it was extremely difficult to rise into that class of society. Maybe you could become a knight or a low-ranking titled noble if you did some sort of heroic deed, but ultimately you're probably going to be treated differently than people that were born into nobility. That is not the case in a Points of Light setting. Deeds, Actions are what get recognition in these harsh worlds, and they are what allow you to move up in the ranks of society. In prepping for this video, I found a blog post over on Dreams of the Lich House that the author, John, put this feature really succinctly for us to examine. And I quote, "The other aspects of Points of Light that resonate with me is its embrace of the American West as a paradigm for society and mobility. Small groups of heroes traveling vast landscapes, dishing out frontier justice, and following a loose code of honor is part of the 19th century gunslinger folklore or the ideals of a knight errant from medieval romances." I think that puts it really nicely, and it kind of encapsulates this idea on how we want to capture social mobility through heroic action within our Points of Light campaign. Elden Ring, while a video game, I think highlights a lot of these 4 features quite well. The Lands Between is a Points of Light setting taken to an extreme. There are almost no safe havens whatsoever, certainly none with a substantial population size left that aren't hostile towards you. The land is seeped with fallen kingdoms, ruins, dungeons, and points of interest that you can delve through in search of better powers and items. The greater world around you is very deadly. Regardless of how strong you become, there are still plenty of monsters that pose difficulties for your questing hero. And finally, you can rise from to the Elden Lord. You do that through your might and magic. Heroic action meets social mobility. So we've discussed the 4 features of a Points of Light setting. You might be wondering, how do we go about making our own sandbox? Where should we start? I'd start by making a simple history outline. Understand the fallen kingdoms and the ruins they've left behind. Understand what caused the light of humanity to dim. What is your cataclysm? From there, I'd look at your map to identify where would the last bastions of humanity be found. Space them out so that they are interconnected, but still quite far from one another. Be sure that there's enough distance between the states so that embarking on a journey is going to be dangerous. Speaking of dangers, decide what haunts your greater wilds, your frontier outside of civilization. Obviously, you can use all sorts of varieties of monsters, that's no problem. But if you want to have some sort of cohesion or themes, now would be a good time to establish them early. So when you're populating your dungeons and random encounter tables, you can make sure that it fits with the locations and the general theme that you're going for. Finally, make sure to set up opportunity for the players to gain upward social mobility. Think about adventure hooks or create obstacles that, if solved by the party, will make them favored by their beneficiaries. You can create corrupt, inept, or unlikable state leaders that can be deposed by upstarts and allow them, even greater social mobility into society. And lastly, I would let money buy solutions or improve the situation of the party. Make sure it's still a focus of the game. They're going out to these dangerous areas to risk their lives for treasure. That treasure should have value in your campaign. Don't let it be an afterthought. So that's it. Let me know if you've played in a Points of Light setting campaign before, or if you've run one. Let me know if you'd like to try and run one. They can be a lot of fun, and I definitely borrow from the 4 features discussed for creating my own campaigns and running them with my own parties. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like. Consider subscribing. It does help the channel out a lot. Check out Enchanted Nimbus, my monthly newsletter. Thanks for hopping aboard the Earthmote. I'll see you in the next one.